Why do we avoid, or have we avoided talking about these things? Well, I think it's a complex thing, but it's helpful to try and unpack some of this. So there's going to be a bit of history, a bit of testimony and other things. But I think one of the key things is actually part of a huge, broad sweep across Western culture. And it's to do with the Enlightenment, which is, well, actually technically we're not meant to talk about the Enlightenment, but many enlightenments, because there are lots of different sort of features and manifestations of it. But there was definitely some degree of cohesion. And of course, one of the key elements of this was the raising, the almost deification of reason, and the way that basically you could have individual knowers who would think and know and figure stuff out. And of course, as that's worked its way out through science and then technology, but also in politics and everything else, it's been remarkably successful, because a lot of the things that it has achieved are clearly quite remarkable. So, people have set foot on the moon. And that, the fact that still to this day only 12 people have, tells you how complicated, expensive, and difficult it is. And that, couldn't have been done before, well, I mean, this is a gross simplification, but before the Enlightenment. There's a whole range of different things going on there. And actually, because the Enlightenment at different points was assaulting the church had to figure out what to do about this. And so, ever since, and we're talking sort of 400 or 500 years, being grossly simplified, but the church has sort of had to duck and dive and respond to the punches. And so inevitably, the ground has very often been ceded to the philosophers and the movers and shakers of the world around. Now, there's a sense in which church history has always been like that, which is one reason why Christians want to gain power to prevent that happening. But that's a whole other story we could talk about. But this has had consequences, because inevitably the philosophers have set the agendas that we've had to try and respond to. So we try to find ways to make the gospel plausible, credible, reasonable. And that's not a wrong thing to do. That was a necessary thing to do. But one of the consequences of this, particularly in the Protestant world, it's affected Catholicism as well, but I think it's fascinating how Protestantism generally, as a broad sweep, has closely been correlated to secularism in a way that didn't quite happen in the same way or scale in the Catholic world. And there are reasons for that. But this has led to, I think, a sense in which what we might call evangelicalism, however you sort of define and classify the tribes within that, is therefore much more modernist than we care to realise, and bears the hallmarks of the battles out of which it's come. Of course it has. But I think we're very nervous of facing up to that, because we want to hold on to the idea that we are purveyors and heralds of the truth, as it always has been. And so we make great store about the heroes of the faith in previous centuries who have preached the same as us, or whatever you might say. So truth matters. I'm not saying it doesn't. It still really does. But the convergence of philosophers and thinkers who started to realize there were flaws with this, and actually the poets and the artists were onto this before the philosophers often. So the Romantic movement being a case in point, they're saying, no, this can't be. There's more to the world. There's more to life. There's more to a person than just a biological machine or systems or whatever. But the key prophet of the 20th century would be Nietzsche. And he was ahead of the game. There was a remarkable biography, I can't remember the name, the author. She's half British, half Norwegian, I think, called I Am Dynamite. And I have to say, reading it, I was incredibly moved by the book. My heart just went out to the man. What a broken, tough life he lived, with a sister who was truly appalling. And she was the one who kind of Nazified Nietzsche. She was a Nazi. And there were aspects of Nazism that they claimed grew out of Nietzsche, but they really didn't. And he was adamantly not anti-Semitic or nationalist. So that there were all kinds of ways in which he was completely traduced by his sister and her family. But he was a very tragic figure who battled ill health most of his life. But he was also a very controversial and difficult person. But he saw it all. That's the incredible thing. And he was, the awkward squad personified. And he basically never lived through it. I think he died in 1901 or something. But he's kind of prophesied the 20th century in all kinds of uncanny ways. And he realized what happens when you kill God. I mean, he used the language of killing God. Now, he was delighted by this, but he could also see what it would lead to, which is basically the will to power, which is not just, I want power, but it's almost like a kind of force of nature, like a hurricane. It's organic and alive and lethal. Because he realized that actually truth claims were not neutral, and that often it was to do with actually who was wielding the claims and what they did with them and what they were trying to do. So he talked a lot about the genealogy of morals. Where has this come from? What is the agenda? What's behind it? And so the totalitarianism of the 20th century, which had begun and briefly flowered after the French Revolution, and they sort of pulled it back, Robespierre himself getting guillotined, and after the terror, they sort of dialed it back. But you saw in the 20th century, actually, the sort of full flourishing, if you like, of what happens, and the Holocaust and the Gulag being a case in point. And one of the things that haunts me, I'm a sort of bit of a nerd about 20th century history, and I've read a lot, and partly my work has taken me into Eastern Europe most of the time in the last 15 years or so. So I'm constantly trying to think about what it was like to live under communism in Eastern Europe and how it manifests now. And you can see all kinds of things that are the result of it. But basically, what you get from all of this is a sense in which those in power use words, use truth to get what they want, not to tell the truth. One of the things that I sometimes sort of go into a complete spiral about is I think, okay, so let's say I'm Churchill or Roosevelt or then Truman. You have the choice to ally with Stalin or Hitler's successor, because one of those two will win. How do you decide? A very secret document, I think it was mentioned in the papers about 10 years ago, that nobody, I think 5 people knew existed. At a certain point during the war, after the states had joined, Churchill asked a couple of aides to draw up, and it's incredibly sensitive, but just asking the impossible question, what if we somehow did a deal with Germany and said, right, get rid of Hitler and Goering and all those crew, but did a deal with Germany and then attacked Russia? Because he had no illusions whatsoever about Stalin. And the Allies knew, for instance, about the Katyn massacre of the whole swathe of officers from the Polish army that Stalin had ordered and then tried to pin on the Nazis. If you've seen the film Enigma, That's the backstory for that. There's a Polish guy at Bletchley Park in the story who had relatives killed at Katyn, and so he will do everything he can to ensure Stalin doesn't win. It's not because he loves Germany, but because Stalin can't win. But they were our allies, and so that's where... and it sort of encapsulates the dilemma. How on earth do you make a decision like that? And, you've got to... Well, I admire Churchill for lots of reasons, but for asking that question, and they, his civil servants, 2 or 3 of them, they went into detail, worked out, okay, how would this work? What would we do? What would he... And then, of course, it didn't happen. What has happened is that basically the will to power has basically seized control of the sort of the industrial state, and that was able to use its power for nefarious ends on an industrial scale. And so the thing to keep reminding yourself is Stalin killed more people than Hitler did. And so this actually led to a crisis for quite a lot of people who've been Marxists. Some held out as Marxists for much longer than perhaps they really should have done. Incidentally, I don't think you can be human if you are not at least attracted to the idealism of communism. Which seems an extraordinary thing to say after what we know of what it led to. But the idealism, you've got to say, okay, yeah, I might not have enjoyed the process, but that's got to be a good way to be. The problem was, as one ex-East German Stasi officer was interviewed and was talking about, he was a believer in Marxism, and he said, he was interviewed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and he said, so, what went wrong? He said, well, the idealism was wonderful. I believed it with all my heart, but it failed to do justice to every person's inner Schweinhund, which literally means pig dog. But it's a sort of German insult that every one of us is a Schweinhund, even if you have good ideals. And so what you find is some of these people who've been Marxist before the Second World War, and then certainly after, when the news of what Stalin has done, and then of course Khrushchev gives his so-called secret speech. It's now out in the open. We can talk even in the Soviet Union about how terrible Stalin was, which actually you can't really do anymore in Russia. I've been to a place in Georgia where there is his old house that is a museum to Stalin, just outside Tbilisi, and his whole house has been sort of encased in a sort of Greek temple where he grew up as a boy, and his father was a cobbler. So the house is there, and there's this big museum, and people were laying wreaths at the statue of Stalin. This was about 2 years ago. People, particularly in France for some reason, began to say, hang on, we've got a big problem here. And they start questioning, what was it that led to this kind of stuff? And the answer was, well, as one famous philosopher, so-called postmodernist, chap called Jean-François Lyotard, and he wrote a very important book that came out in, I think, 1980, and was translated, unusually rather, it was translated into English quite soon, because it was clearly significant. The book's called The Postmodern Condition. And he has a famous line that gets repeated by everybody. I define postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives. In other words, the grand story, the big explanation, the thing that holds it all together, whether it's Marxist or fascist or Christian or Muslim or capitalist or nationalist, you name it, any ist or ism is the problem. And so we rejoice in our little stories, and we're content with that. And actually, other philosophers would talk about la jouissance, the joy of being immersed in all this stuff, and rejoicing that we can take off the burdens of the grand story and just be in our own little silos. Because actually, if you've seen all this happen in the name of a belief that you pin your life on, and many people did, you're going to reject that and say this doesn't work, but you're not going to come running to the arms of Jesus, are you? because you accept the critics of Marxism, of religion, because that's just yet another meta-narrative. So let's just get rid of the lot. And why? Well, it's because of the abuse of power. That's right at the heart of this. Incredulity towards meta-narratives, not because they're not idealistic and lovely and beautiful, maybe, but because it doesn't work because of each person's inner Schweinhund. I don't trust people. And this basically has grown inevitably, I think, out of Enlightenment thinking like acid. And acid corrodes even strong metals. I'm not a chemist. I don't understand how this works. I just got a picture of, apparently that's acid on metal, which is pretty gross. But anyway, the problem is the Enlightenment began with questioning inherited truths, ideas, thoughts, the, in quotes, old wives' tales, the superstitions. Why should kings rule just because of who they've been born to? Why should aristocrats have power just because they inherited it? That's unreasonable. And actually, we all know every aristocratic family, they're always the sort of black sheep. There's the crazy fifth Earl, and then the 17th Duke went off with somebody in Brazil, and you name it, all kinds of crazy stories. There is nothing about genetics that necessarily means they're going to be trustworthy to rule. So let's get rid of that. And religion. I mean, it's a superstition, a lot of it, and frankly, a lot of medieval Christianity was superstition and didn't have much to do with what we might associate Christianity with. But actually, even the idea of God, creation, a soul, it's unreasonable. So the driver of this kind of thinking was skepticism. The difficulty is, as the last 5 centuries has proven, you can't stop it. Because once you start being skeptical, where do you stop? And what happened is, well, these great ideals that grew out of modernism, which is like Enlightenment thinking in power, people then say, oh, but look what it does with its power. That's pretty ugly. We don't want that to ever happen again. And so we start applying the skepticism that led to this to the framework itself and say, okay, well, let's just get rid of all frameworks. And so on and so forth. Now, this has worked its way in all kinds of ways into culture, but it's worked its way particularly, and I think you see this now in the last 15 or 20 years in our context, by what, even if it's not spoken, is uppermost in people's minds if they darken the doors of the church, which, let's face it, frankly, they're not going to. We are still, as you see all around, assuming and expecting the world to come to church. They're not going to. And even when we mix in our in our groups and go to conferences, maybe it's a big sort of ministers' conference in London or whatever, and we can pack out a huge auditorium. We are minnows. We are invisible. Nobody knows about us, and we're just a tiny, tiny proportion of people in this country. And I can tell you, if you think it's bad here, it's much worse on the continent. Much worse. And I think the thing I've spent most of my time is just hanging out with pastors who are lonely. And nobody understands them. And that includes people in their churches. Understand what they're trying to do. But let's imagine, for the sake of it, people say, oh, one day, wake up, I'm going to go to church. Now, 50, 60 years ago, probably, and I'm putting words in people's mouth, but probably people would come in and say, okay, how do I know this is all true? And you've got your, Josh McDowell, you've got your 2 Ways to Live, you've got your bullet points, and Caesar's Gallic Wars, we all know how many copies there were of that, and that'll be helpful because the Bible has many more, and you think, oh yeah, I've never heard of Caesar's Gallic Wars, but anyway, that sounds good. And it goes on like this, and then eventually they sign the dotted line, hallelujah, let's baptize and move on. But today, that's just not going to happen. And probably, even if they don't say it, uppermost in their mind is not is this true, or how can I believe this, but am I safe? Are they going to take my money? Are they going to change my personality? Are they going to abuse my children? Are they going to make me do things I don't want to do? Am I going to have to sign something? Is this the end of my life as we know it? What will my parents say when I've suddenly given half my income to the church? And that's not irrational. That is actually sensible, because stories after stories come out again and again, and I promise you, they're going to be more and more. It's not going away, this. They're going to be more. Where you see horror stories. And Netflix, they churn out documentaries about cults and things. And, I've gone down rabbit holes there and watched some of them, and you just think, wow, that's terrible. And then you come across another documentary and say, I've heard of that group. And they were present at that conference I went to. And then before long, it's, I know him. Am I safe? And if you have kids, and it's not just the Catholics with their altar boys and choirs. And so actually this just bears out the zeitgeist, what everybody is thinking, that basically you cannot trust people or institutions with power, because look what they do with it. And unfortunately, and this is unfair, because I'm sure we all know good examples. I know good examples. Please don't get the impression from today that it is all utterly bleak. It isn't. But let's face it, sometimes the church is even worse than the world. But they're playing the same games. And so people say, it's the meta-narrative that's the problem. We can't be doing with that. And so you go down other routes and sources. And I think sometimes that's why New Age stuff is attractive, because it's much more DIY, or some sort of Buddhism or variations on Eastern religion, because it's much more individualistic, apparently, although some aspects of it really aren't, but that's a whole other thing. And so the assumption is we live in a post-Christian society, increasingly so, but the irony is they're not rejecting Christianity, they're rejecting churchianity and what they've seen it do. So in many ways, functionally, they're pre-Christian. But they assume they know what has happened, and that's why they don't want anything to do with it. And I couldn't agree more. And sometimes I wake up and think, why am I still in this thing? Any sort of quick comments or questions on that? Yeah.
It's more of a thought that crossed my mind, but there's a sense in which quite often when I think about postmodernism and I've spoken or brought it into a sermon or whatever it is, it's always very negative. But just as you were talking about it there in its context, I was just struck by actually how resonant it is with the Tower of Babel. That we're nervous when people try to make a name for themselves. It's a big meta-narrative. They're almost imitating God without knowing it by saying, no, we must scatter. No big meta-narrative by which we're going to ascend upwards. Let's scatter.
That's fascinating.
And of course, they're doing, in a sense, they're imaging God. But they're not realizing that there's one who can make a meta-narrative, because it's not about us making a name for ourselves, but about him establishing a name. But that instinct to say, you can't let a nation make a name for itself, or an ideology make a name for itself. It's too damaging. Scatter.
That's a fascinating point. And of course, immediately after, God gives Abraham a name.
Yes,
it's not his. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And you see, I actually have found myself thinking, actually, in many ways, I am a postmodernist now. Because there are so many aspects of modernism that I see left, right, and centre in myself, in my church, in my culture, that you just think, no! Which is why James K.A. Smith, one of his earlier books, is Who's Afraid of Postmodernism? And he's calling for a kind of good theological postmodernism. And whether or not you can use that kind of language, that's a whole moot point. But I completely sympathise with that agenda, because actually we resonate with a lot of the crits of Enlightenment modernist thinking. And I think the Bible does too, and that's a great example I've not thought of. Now, this gets a sort of bit nitty-gritty, because one of the ways in which this has manifested in recent years is, and you hear a lot talk about it, and I'm not an expert, I've read a little bit, and it's like those, there are sort of thousands of different species of this, but critical theory is one of those things that gets wheeled about quite a lot. And in some circles, just the mention of the words is like a lightning rod. That'll get temperatures rising and hackles raised. There was a couple of articles on Gospel Coalition in 2019 by Shenvi and Sawyer. I don't know them, but they actually did quite a good job, I thought, just giving a survey of what we're talking about this. And so I think there's a link on the reading list to the title of it. And they're very clear about saying, look, there are lots of different schools of thought that operate under this, and so people mean slightly different things by it. But it is a dog whistle, and basically people will start sort of getting terrified of cultural Marxism and all kinds of other things that will just get hearts racing. But I think whether or not this is a good or helpful or realistic tactic, the motivation behind a lot of this stuff is to empower the voiceless and the vulnerable, to show them kindness, and to bring some degree of restitution for victims of injustice. What's not to like? Those are good things. But there are problems. Not, I hasten to add, because that oppression of non-white races, of women, of sexual minorities, of classes, of political opponents, etc., 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 that is not a figment. These things have happened, and they are atrocities done in the name of all kinds of things that even we hold dear. But you see, I think the great irony of this is not that it goes too far, but that it doesn't go anything like far enough. It doesn't actually go as far as the Bible dares to go. Now, at its worst, it becomes a kind of a glaze or a shade that you paint onto your spectacles, and everything suddenly comes up in this color. Basically, you see power abuse identified and blamed for every single social ill there is. Power abuse is there lurking behind every bush. And I get that. If your fingers have been burned, you are particularly sensitive to fire, because you don't want that again. I found this extraordinary quote from the Dalai Lama from I think it was in late 70s, early 80s, but at a time when they thought they could negotiate with China. And they were having all these sort of negotiations about how things were going to develop and whether or not they could have some kind of accommodation for the Lama's people and so on. And of course, it ended up fruitless, and they just took over. But the Dalai Lama is quoted as saying, and I can't get it exactly right, but it's something like, when you've been bitten by a snake, every piece of rope is a snake. So of course, if you've been hurt, you will see this everywhere. And there are psychological reasons for that. And we've got to be sensitive to that. That's one of the real difficulties here, is that yes, there are distortions, but they are because of horrible precedent. And so disputing these things is incredibly complex. And if you're not careful, just the fact of saying, well, hang on a minute, can actually increase the oppression. And that is actually a tool to silence sometimes. Look, you are triggering me, so I'm going to deplatform you. And the awful thing is that this good thing then becomes its own meta-narrative and totalizing. So, this is really, really difficult. So then what is the solution? Well, very often the solution is basically put the victims in charge, or the survivors. Okay, all these different categories of people that usually end up being the same people, so dead white European males and some living ones. Okay, they've had not just their day, their millennia. Let's give other people a go, because at least it's going to be better than them. Will they differ from any other cohort in power? The monarchs and aristocrats, they were clearly up to no good, so let's give it to the bourgeoisie. That's what happened after the French Revolution. Well, they failed. We needed to give it to the workers. So there were various uprisings in France, the Paris Commune and things like that. But the Marxists, as became, and then under Lenin and then Stalin, they were saying, no, the French didn't go far enough. We've got to go the whole hog, give it to the workers, and create a new aristocracy. Oh, well, let's give it to the minorities. But you give it a new aristocracy. And it's seen again and again and again, the formerly oppressed inevitably, question, I don't know, become oppressors. And critical theory doesn't seem to have anything to say about that. The problem is well articulated, but the solution is underdeveloped, and they say, well, let's just see what happens. Well, okay. And actually, the danger is victimhood is the trump card, and basically you get into all kinds of other knots. You can see this happening in South America with liberation theology, which kind of splurged Marxism with the Bible. And there are definitely parallels. And one of the interesting things is that, you cannot understand Marxism without the framework of the Bible. It's basically a theologically Christian, not even Jewish, but theologically Christian framework, just without the supernatural bit, so it's shrunk. But it's the same thing. So it is very compatible. And so the liberation theologians claimed inspiration from both Moses and Marx and Jesus. And so the meta-narrative becomes one of the slaves in Egypt. But of course that misses out Genesis. It's all well and good to see parallels in Exodus, and they are there. But there's all kinds of stuff going on in Genesis that is not about Israel per se, but about humanity. And there is no real accounting for evil. Now, there's this famous quote from Solzhenitsyn, I'm sure you all know, from the Gulag Archipelago. But I want to read the whole paragraph because it's fascinating. You know about the Gulag Archipelago, so basically it's one of the most searing accounts, and it was sort of seismic, explaining and describing the experience of being in the Soviet Gulag, north of the Arctic Circle in Siberia, in these labor camps. And Solzhenitsyn writes extraordinarily about it, and at length. It's a long book. But he describes, thinking about himself in the context, and I think, if I remember, the catalyst for this bit is when he sees one of the in these camps they would have criminals who were there in the camps as punishment were given responsibility and authority over the politicals. And the Nazis did exactly the same in the concentration camps as well. And so, they were particularly brutal. They weren't selected for their leadership skills, put it that way. And he saw one of these capos, they were called, was beating up a prisoner that Solzhenitsyn knew. And it was very disturbing. There was nothing he could do about it, he witnessed it. And it suddenly hit him that actually, supposing he'd been the guard, he would have been doing it. And that, we all like to think that we'd be different, but the reality is very few of us would have the courage to be different. And that's what just bowled him over. He said this: "In the intoxication of youthful successes, I had felt myself to be infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. In my most evil moments, I was convinced I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. And it was only when I lay there on the rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political orders, nor between minorities and majorities and any other grouping you scared to name, but right through every human heart, through all human hearts. Even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil." Which is exactly what the Bible has always said. To think of Babel, that didn't come out of nowhere. That's Genesis 11, after the fall. And so I think it needs to be named, but I don't quite know what we do about it. And one needs to be very careful, treat this with kid gloves, simply because of the reality of victimhood. But we just got to be very careful if that becomes a currency. And it does, and people exploit it. Why? Well, because the line between good and evil passes through every heart. So a necessary thing to be articulated can also become a tool for oppression. And the minorities or the people given power today are frankly no different. We shouldn't be surprised. We don't look down on them because we know we're the same. So is it any surprise that actually people have said, oh, okay, there is Stonewall. I remember when the coalition government came in, it was the first time I think that Stonewall had a full-time officer in number 10 with camera. And have done ever since. And it's only after some of the things with that clinic, what was it called? The Tavistock, that people have begun to say, oh, hang on a minute. Their advocacy, they are representing, they are speaking out for victims, but now they also have power. Oh, there's some blurred lines there. Leave aside the ethics and the question. There's something going on here with power, which I think is why people, and so Stonewall have had to step back a bit because of the outcry, because they are trying to be all of these things in a kind of monopoly. And I think it's fair to say, I don't know whether I'm going to be sued, but I think there is a sense in which this is used to silence people. Which is not to say there isn't an injustice that needs to be raised. You see, I'm very nervous even of mentioning it because actually I do believe in some of the reasons why this happens, why people are being given a voice, because we don't know what they're thinking, and so we need to hear. We don't know what the experience was like of X, Y, Z. And that, I think, is a Christian thing to do, to listen to people who are different, for whatever reason. A good friend of mine, some of you know him, and we were colleagues at All Souls for 10 years, is Rico Tyson. I remember, he's created the Christianity Explored course, and I remember having a little discussion with Rico because he would often speak in, when he was trying to articulate sin and so on, he would often speak about how we are not victims, we are perpetrators. And that is true. We are all perpetrators. Each of us sins in our own peculiar and extraordinary ways. And your temptations will not be mine. And the things that I just shrug off, and it's just not an issue, could be your biggest hang-up. And that's fundamental to anyone in pastoral ministry for 5 seconds. we're all very different, but sometimes we converge. But the point is, yes, my heart, even as I speak today, is so mixed and messed up in all kinds of ways. So some of the things I'm articulating today, I articulate them because I see them in myself. But where I was concerned is not that you shouldn't talk about all being perpetrators, but please don't say you're not victims, because the reality is every single one of us has suffered because of another's sin. And it may actually be not just a person, it might be a system. It's so interesting, but because we're modernists, we're individualists, and so therefore we don't like thinking about corporate life. So sometime when you're really bored and this library is big and open and has all kinds of big systematic theologies, just spend an afternoon when it's raining perhaps, going through the one-volume systematic theologies and have a little list on a scrap of paper where you compare and contrast how many pages each systematic volume gives to individual sin and how many it gives to corporate sin. And it will blow your tiny minds. Because you'll think, whoa, he's hardly said anything. I looked at Grudem, that was the one I first looked at. I haven't done a systematic survey at all, but basically I think it got a couple of paragraphs on one page and there are about 130 about sin individually. Now, I think there's a good reason why we don't go there, it's because it's so flipping complicated. Where do you begin? Does this mean I can't shop at Primark anymore? I remember working through the book of Revelation with a home group we were in when we lived in Uganda, and stuff about trade and the king of Tyre and all of that stuff. You're suddenly thinking, okay, here we are in the Roman Empire, everything depends on the wheels being oiled and trade, the Pax Romana, we're all part of this thing, and this is what gives us the opportunities to preach the gospel here, and Paul can travel all around the Mediterranean as a citizen, and it's great, look at all these advantages, and that's why we shouldn't do Brexit. Oh, no, sorry. And basically, you think, oh, but this is an oppressive institution. Okay, so what do I do about this? Well, I stop eating food sacrificed to idols. Well, that basically means I can't do any business because all deals are sealed with a sacrifice at the temple to Aphrodite. So I'm basically withdrawing from the stock market. Why? Because I won't eat that food. Oh, but they don't really exist. I don't believe in idols. I believe in Jesus. So we're freed from that. Okay, well, it's your conscience. That's fine. You make up your mind. That's what Paul is saying. But are there other ways in which I compromise because I'm just part of the system, or I go to Aldi rather than somewhere at the local grocers or whatever? It's cheap. Why? And the moment you start asking those questions, you think, whoa, I don't know where to begin working out what is the ethical thing. It's really difficult. So you say, all right, well, let's just stick with sex and money. And we won't talk about power. Do you see? We are the victims of this as well as the perpetrators. But actually, even at the very personal level, if somebody has suffered at the hands of an abuse of power, if you say we're not victims, they're going to have a dissonance there. They're going to think, well, okay, so what? Was that not sinful against me? That was wrong. That shouldn't have happened. And actually, you're causing somebody to really stumble and have this kind of disconnect their experience with their theology. But I think the Bible is very clear. We are both. It's just that the Bible goes much further than everybody else. And so, I think we need to talk about sin more, but in a way that actually does justice to everybody's experience. So we need to actually go into a bit more depth, and we need to ask these difficult, bigger questions about, we're all part of this. I think I first began to think about this was, we lived in Uganda for about 4 years. I was teaching in a seminary there, and then, this is 20 years ago, I don't think it's that different now, but only a third of the streets in Kampala, the capital, were tarmac. So it was still mainly dirt roads. We lived down the end of the dirt road. And you would, wherever you are in Africa, certainly East Africa, it's one of the most extraordinary things. You can break down in the middle of nowhere and you'll see people walking. So you're never alone. It can be a great advantage, especially if you break down. But anyway, there will always be people walking. And I remember seeing this kid, maybe sort of 10, maybe 12, I don't know, just walking down our track near where we were. And he was wearing a Playboy t-shirt. I can't remember what the slogan was, but it was the bunny and all of that stuff. And basically, he obviously had no clue what it meant. And I wasn't inclined to tell him either. Fine, it was a nice t-shirt. But basically, thousands of cast-off clothes end up in the markets in Africa and other places. And basically, traders will buy a huge sack full. They don't know what's in it. They'll spend, I don't know, £5 for a huge thing, and then they'll sell the contents. They have no idea what they're getting, and they're all cast-offs, end of season, all that sort of stuff. So they're brand new, really good clothes, but and it's like, do you even know what this is part of and what this represents? And it affects even there. It's just mind blowing. I'm going to move quicker through these two, and then try and draw some of this together before we step to lunch. That is, in fact, Dan. And I think it's Air Linear. And I think we're going for a little jaunt this afternoon. If you have privilege, and I speak as someone who has a lot, nobody wants to give it up. If you're honest. I mean, once you've tasted first class, why go economy? I've had one time when I was upgraded, and the moment on a plane, it was an 11-hour flight or something, and I will never forget the bliss of that moment of stretching out my legs, and I couldn't feel the end. And it was like, this is where I belong. People talk about white privilege and white supremacy. These are realities. It's not wokeism. There are ways in which there are things I don't even have to think about. Anywhere in the world, almost, because I'm white, because I'm male, because I'm rich, because I'm educated, I can read, I know 1 or 2 different languages, I have contacts, I have a phone with an address book all over the world. My organization has contacts literally on every continent and in most regions. If I'm in trouble, there's somebody I can ring everywhere. I don't even think about it. I just think, yeah, that's cool. So I'm planning to go to Ukraine at last in September. So the western part of the country, the Foreign Office has said that they lifted some of the restrictions to go there. So really hoping and praying I can get there, and I'll be with Sergey and so on. But I'm thinking, okay, I've never been to a war zone before, but I've got friends. I'll be okay. I've always have been. There are many people who don't even have a tenth of what I have and can't imagine ever not being afraid or just on alert. Now, there are other ways in which I've experienced that. So I was at a boarding school from the age of 8 to 18, and I was bullied for 3.5 years. And so I know what it is to be on constant high alert. That's one of the repercussions of that. You are waiting for the next assault, and it could come from any corner. That gives me a sense of what we're talking about here. But if you've got the privilege, once you've seen it, and you realize that other people don't have it but want it, you think, well, no, you can't. This is mine. And you worry that if you start exposing your blind spots and the ways in which your tribe has its privileges and comforts, the whole thing will crumble. And it'll be toppled just as Red Russia toppled White Russia in the Russian Civil War. And if you were aristocratic, even if you had a vaguely aristocratic name, or than you be for the job. Well, you don't want that. And then finally, this is a very sort of mundane thing, but I think this is just reality. I think we can see this in all kinds of ways when we're trying to recruit people for leadership. All of this has a kind of accumulative weight. It might be worldview, philosophical, it might be personal experience, it might be the wider culture, it might be the fear of all the paperwork that goes with safeguarding, it might be, you name it, all of these things, and you think, why on earth would I want to do that? And so many people are saying, well, I'm just going to keep my head down, I'm going to get a decent job, earn my way, maybe go on holiday a couple of times a year with my family. I'm not ambitious, I don't want to rise, and I certainly don't want to lead, because look at the stress. I don't want that. And I think you're seeing that in all kinds of contexts, but you're certainly seeing that in churches. And it's not simply because the Church of England is shrinking. I think Oak Hill only has 3 ordinands next year. And that's the biggest college. Now, they're finding other ways to survive, and no doubt all the other colleges could say a similar story. And there's obviously time for more people to sign up, but that's tiny. And I think this is part of it. Why would I want to put myself and my family through all this? It's too much. I don't want this. Okay, I've blared on for a jolly long time. Are there any thoughts or comments? Or are you bludgeoned into silence?
Stay there this meeting. It is just the complexity of it and the impenetrability of the fact that there is truth in the midst of the distortion. It's quite overwhelming sometimes. It just feels. I don't need to feel like a bit depressed.
It is.
Where do you start? How do you? But I guess we've got to keep reminding ourselves that Jesus is still Lord and
He is.
what stuff for us to do. But,
And actually, it's not, well, so the final chapter in Wilderness of Mirrors is basically not just simply saying Jesus is Lord, but it's saying, what a Lord. And in the end, the only thing we've got is look what he did with his power. Somebody mentioned that when we were looking at those passages. But okay, yeah, the church has had a pretty grisly, not entirely negative. There have been some highlights which the world doesn't want to talk about and acknowledge. No, there are some amazing things. And everybody says, oh, it picks out abolition. Well, no, actually, that really is a thing. I could give you lots of interesting examples about how that in itself changed people, not just those who were enslaved. But in the end, the only thing we've got is the best thing we've got, which is what we've got, which is Jesus. And so the symbol at one level is not simply the cross, although that is so multi-layered, it's very difficult to see what that means. But I think it's the foot washing. That's where I need to start all the time. How many CEOs and generals and kings do that?
The thing that struck me, Mark, a lot of this is it's kind of all sin, isn't it? Like creation, leadership, authority is a good thing, it's from God, but we're fallen, so we've messed it all up. We're perpetrators and we're victims. It's depressing, and I feel at the moment as a pastor, a bit like I'm living in a climate of fear. I'm terrified of messing up and abusing power.
Yep.
And I'm terrified of being accused of it unjustly.
And that happens.
And it's very tempting to, like the psalmist, I want to fly away and curl up in the desert, But it's that creation fall. But there is redemption, there is the Holy Spirit, there is Jesus. So I'm not totally lost heart. That actually God can redeem. Being a pastor, being a leader. But all of this stuff, it's really, really helpful. Just breaking it down.
in a grim way.
Yeah, I was really interested in it about the kind of currency of victimhood, and I absolutely heard your kind of like, how do we talk about this? And I think my background's working in violence against women and girls, but I've also lived in Uganda, working on projects there, and looking at that in terms of power and control, which is kind of what started me looking more at power, is from that kind of background, which is a slightly different perspective. But I think one of my reflections is kind of what you were saying about our failure is that there's something still we need to hear, and that sometimes we've almost failed to bear witness because things can be so difficult. So then they've been quick to give power rather than actually bear witness to the horrificness of some people's circumstances, collectively, individually, because it's too much. So therefore we just then give power without actually staring in the face of situations.
That's a very helpful point. And actually, so one of the things we might come to, but I think in a church context, which I assume is what most of us are sort of thinking of as we ponder these things, there are one or two diagnostic tool isn't quite the right word, but methods or approaches. And I think one of them, and it has to be done with strict confidence and anonymity, which is a threat to some, but often the first people I would want to talk to in a context of a church where maybe something's not quite right would be in confidence the women and the artists in the broadest sense. People, creative professionals. I mean, I hate trying to find words for that. I hate calling people creatives. But because the women very often, and actually, interestingly, this has nothing to do with the theology of women and the debates about roles of women and stuff. Forget about that. And I've seen really good things in the more conservative, and I've seen really terrible things in the more liberal, and vice versa. It doesn't bear any relation to actually necessarily what the theology is, although it does sometimes. But actually, for one or two to have a chance to say honestly, without fear of repercussion, exactly what it's like to be a woman in that church or institution. And I think that's often so revealing. And I've seen that happen. So Nay Dawson has just produced a book called She Needs, which I wrote the foreword to. And in a way, she's doing exactly that. And it's deeply, deeply upsetting reading. And I know for a fact that the different people who contributed, and it's all anonymized, are from the widest range of theological positions there is. So it's really not about saying one thing or another, although Nay certainly has her views and other people have their views, but that's not the point. The point is but I've heard people say, oh, well, no, she's just got an agenda with that book, and say, well, we mustn't, we don't need to read this. That is just scurrilous. It's not true. But artists, very often, it's because they are sensitive to things that other people aren't. And they can describe things, maybe through a painting or a piece of music or whatever, even when, and perhaps often, especially when, they don't have vocabulary for it. So they might know something's wrong, but not know what is wrong. And again, I've seen that happen a lot. Anyway, that's just, I think that's important. Yeah.
Also, children and young people.
Right, yes, good.
They often pick up things quite clearly because they've got no external stuff going on. And I think we need to listen to them as well.
Yeah. That's so good. I remember, I've had battles with mental illness and depression for years. And my biggest fear all the time was our kids. And sometimes when I was really bad, I would lash out and say things that are just awful. And one of the, I can't remember who first told me, I learned this early on. She said, the thing about kids is they see everything and understand nothing. But they think it's always their fault. So they see something that's wrong and they assume it's because they didn't finish their cereal. Or you're angry with them because the teacher complained about their homework. Or anyway, just trivialities. And so one of the things after this was pointed out to me, I realized they think probably that Daddy is ill because of them. And I had to make it very clear to them, no, look, I had issues even before you existed, so it's not your fault. But I think I hadn't thought of it in terms of the fellowship and the institution stuff, but I think that's really helpful. And it's interesting, isn't it, sometimes, and it's not exclusive to this, but you see sometimes one of the things that can make it easier for a church to go wrong is that it's kind of monochrome, not just in terms of, well, skin colour, but age. So one church I know where basically they said, right, it's university students, that's what we're here for. Grown-ups, in quotes, can be part of us, but it's all about the students. And so there were no families there. And I remember as a student loving being with families because that was like normal. That was cool. That you talk to people who are different generations is really valuable anyway. But you can see, oh well, no, for the strategy, for the mission, for the thing, we're going to be. It's just we really want to make this count type thing. So you're never going to get kids there.
Yeah, having young people on the PCC
Wow.
is really quite illuminating.
You've seen that work well?
I've seen it once,
Right.
so yeah, maybe it can work well.
Mm.
You've just got one person who's got that voice.
Because I suppose if there's a youth worker, we just relied on the youth worker to give their perspective, rather than actually,
I think on an individual sort of pastoral level, this idea of the victim who is also the sinner who does bad things as well, that's very difficult pastorally because when someone has been badly hurt and damaged, they will naturally respond because we're all sinful sinfully, but that's very difficult pastorally to challenge someone who is kind of bleeding. And I think that is one of the hardest things pastorally, just on an individual level, but presumably the same on a bigger scale as well, because you just feel like you're kicking someone who's already down. I think that's a very skillful part.
It is, and one of the most essential factors that hardly ever gets explicitly talked about is time, and how quick we are to impose timetables on sanctification, on forgiveness, on you name it. Well, it's been 6 months now. What are you doing? Come on.
It's interesting, Fiona's analogy of bleeding. If someone was bleeding, you'd say, well, get better first.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about.
What were you doing with that knife? Or whatever.
But it takes a long time. It's like years.
Yes.
So that is really difficult pastorally.
And because of that, it doesn't fit with pretty much any mission strategy. It's a kind of antithesis of that.
And also, I think when someone has been badly hurt, we're all like this. We want revenge, not justice. And
Right.
I think that's quite hard as well.
And I've got a situation at the moment where
punished.
okay, the voice has been heard and there's been some action and response, but it's limited and not satisfactory, but it's not nothing. It's been talked about publicly, and this individual cannot move on until there's total annihilation.
And that's where the person who's been hurt actually becomes,
Exactly.
they want to be God and they want to punish and destroy.
and trying to hold to vengeance is mine, says the Lord, mine to repay. Ouch. But the crucial thing is time and patience, and in the end, what that makes clear is that this is all about relationships. All of this. And that people who've had a rough time somewhere can only begin to change and feel safe when time has proved that they are safe. So there's no 5-point plan to restore trust, ever. There's no course you can go on. Some of you are aware of L'Abri. L'Abri in Hampshire is a place that has been a real oasis for me over the years. Founded by Francis Schaeffer in the 50s in Switzerland, and there are now about 10 all around the world. And it's basically a community. It's open. You can go for an hour or a year, and it's a kind of, well, there are not many Protestant sort of evangelical monasteries, but it's not a monastery, but it's learned a lot from that. And I remember talking to a dear friend who's been a worker there for a long time, and she had, and each of the workers, there are about 5 or 6, is assigned one of the guests to mentor for however long they're there, usually once a week or whatever. And it's pretty informal and relaxed. But these guys who are workers, they've been tested in the fires, as it were. So they're good people. And I remember she was talking about this lass who had come. She was a university student, and basically it was one of those situations where in her life and childhood, everyone had let her down. Her parents had let her down, siblings, she was in care, she had friends, but they let her down, she'd been bullied at school, blah, blah, blah. And so basically, absolutely integral to her pain and trauma was that she couldn't trust anybody for good reason. And you wouldn't. And it's the classic I am a rock, the sort of Simon Garfunkel thing. You have a sort of a tortoise shell. And this friend of mine, she was really getting to know her, and she'd come for a turn after a few sort of dips in the water, toe in the water, and she'd come for a term, and that was a massive thing for her to say, right, I'm going to come here for 3 months. And they would meet, I can't remember, let's say for the sake of argument, sort of Tuesday afternoons at 3 or whatever. And my friend really made, this was absolutely imprinted into her brain. This was absolutely sacrosanct. Anyway, about halfway through the term, I don't know, she suddenly had lots to do, and that Tuesday, she suddenly realised that there was a big thing happening the next day, and it was her job to go shopping and buy all the supplies. So she zooms off to the Tesco, it almost has sort of 2 trolleys and tons of stuff, and then at about 3:15, her heart sinks, and she thinks, it's all over, I've blown it. Because this was just in stone, this was this girl's time. And she left the trolley, she hurtled back and came rushing to find her in the library there. And she was in floods. And she said, I'm so sorry, I don't know what came over me, I've always... And basically, what changed everything was that for this lass, she was the first person who apologized. Mm-hmm. So actually, in God's economy, this is what needed to happen. And she suddenly realized, actually, yeah, people make mistakes, but I can still trust you because I know you love me. Mm-hmm. That changes everything. And there's no program for that.